10 seconds or so, and then I will introduce myself, make a few introductory remarks, and let you know who we've got speaking this evening. So I think probably everyone who's coming in is in for the start. So thank you very much. My name is Christine Blower. I'm a teacher trade unionist and Labour member of the House of Lords, nominated, of course, by Jeremy Corbyn. I don't need to tell you that we're going through a major global crisis, but it's down to us on the left to put forward ways of ideas to transform our world and put people and health and our planet first. And part of this must be changing the way that the world is ordered and standing up to those leaders globally who promote policies of war and hate. We think in particular of President Trump, but on this call we'll also be thinking of President Bolsonaro. Part of this must also be a progressive international cooperation on the left. And that's why we're delighted to have a global platform and to be building links between the left here in Britain and the left in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, and beyond, globally, in fact. Arise is a celebration of our values of peace, internationalism, solidarity, and unity. And we're delighted to have you here as part of that discussion today. And critically, at this moment, we must be part of standing with Black Lives Matter, this global uprising, a movement to change the world for the better. Now, due to the amazing level of interest in this, as well as the Zoom seminar, we're streaming direct from the Arise YouTube channel and across various Facebook pages. So as the event goes on, feel free to post questions, but depending on how much time we have left after we've heard from our brilliant speakers, we may or may not be able to get to those. But let me first introduce our speakers. I will introduce them as they come up, but this is the order in which they will be speaking. We have David Miranda, who is a Brazilian socialist congressman and LGBT leader. We have Marisa Matias, who is from the Portuguese Left Block. She's an MEP. We have Danielle Obono, who is a left-wing French MP for La France insoumise, Unbowed France. We have Gyekye Tanoh from the Third World Network in Ghana. And finally, to conclude the evening, we have Jeremy Corbyn, who needs no further introduction than that. So let me move immediately, David, to you. We're delighted. So David Miranda, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this great opportunity and the invitation to be a part of the Arise movement that connects people around the world to debate what we think that needs to be the world after this pandemic that we are living in now. And I just want to go touch a few points with everybody because in order to build a new planet and a society where we can live, we have to address the issues the society has. And we are passing through this pandemic because of the slaughter of animals that is happening all the time. And because we are eating animals all the time, and not a vegetarian yet, but I'm doing the process of thinking, change my habits now, because the way we do and deal with the animals in the world is bringing this pandemic. We brought another pandemic in 2009. And this is the way that we are ending up the Amazonia, for example, here in Brazil, because we need to address this kind of issues because the environment is needed our help and attention. And that's only happened because of the capitalism. It's all predatory and use everything, the resources that we have, but also as well put the kind of element, a kind of food that we're going to be eating. Something that it looks only for the rich people to become vegan. But also, I wanted to address, like Christine was saying, the Black Lives Matters, because I'm Black. I'm doing it. Only 22 of 513 congressmen, congresswomen are Black in Brazil. They describe themselves as Black, and has together move around this movement. This movement that has been brought in the US, so much attention, explode around the world, even in the middle of this pandemic, has shown the violence that the police has brought to the Black community has been endorsed for many, many years here in Brazil, especially on the slumbos, the favelas that we have. Just this year alone, we have more than 300 deaths by the state police going there. Most of those people are Black, but also, like, we have a 400 people that got killed by the COVID-19. So it shows, like, this entire year we have the state killing people, even with the pandemic. And so the movement of Black Lives Matters going to the streets is very, very strong. And it doesn't matter if we don't change the way the parliament works, because if you don't have Black people thinking and working directly with the society, that's never going to change. The movement that is growing now is the movement to bring solutions for the future. Obama was elected in the US, was a Black president, but he doesn't have any kind of policies to bring down the violence against his own community, the Black people over there. Another thing that we need to address is how xenophobia is happening in the entire Europe, because the parliament in there has been prevent, like, the borders, and those peoples need shelter, they need to be in another countries, because UK, France, and many other countries in the European has brought the violence and the war for their shores. And for that sake, they don't have a place to go. So for that sake, I say that we have to address no borders as something that we have to look up for the future, because if we have borders and we have a parliament that is mostly white, and the xenophobia, it's always going to be perceived and prevent people of colors, but people from other countries, to be safe in the UK, in France, and all the other countries. And finally, not and the last, we have all seen that we face, like, the new faces in the world now, the new generation of fascism on the world. Bolsonaro has been one of the biggest threat for the Brazilian population. We have more than 1,600,000 of cases of COVID-19. He doesn't respect the international world of health administration. We don't have a minister from health in place more than 30 or 40 days now. And we have now close to 700,000 deaths on the country. So when you have a president that is open, LGBT phobic, racist, and you have a platform for those kind of people, you destroy what democracy represents. And for changing the world, we need to think how to people who use now the internet, who use now everything that we can connect to with social media, and how to present this as a magnificent tool for changing the world that we wanted to live in. It's a world without racism, without border. It's without misogyny that is killing all the women and sisters, the violence of the state, but also look to the economy that the states have to have in order to help to change this social and economic imbalance that we have around the globe. that is the capitalism that has brought us in every each single way. So to look to the future and to change the future, we need to look to address those kind of issues inside the society. We need to be aware of how those issues not only affect the everyday life of people around the globe, but also we need to address how the parliament is being addressed with those issues, because we cannot have like presidents like Trump or Bolsonaro having the power to dictate the future of the people, because Bolsonaro, as much as Trump, are destroying families' lives with their policies. And we need to be able to stop like the message, the fake news to spread. And we need, as a left, give the option for the people, and especially for the laborers of the world, to unite and to fight for a more just world. We can have peace amongst all of us. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for that opening. It's a very broad topic that we're looking at this evening, and you brought out some very interesting ideas there. Thank you very much, David. Now we will move to Marisa Matias, who is from the Portuguese Left Block. She is an MEP. We look forward to hearing her contribution. Marisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Hi, everybody, and thank you for this session in such an important topic, and of course, in an important festival like it is Arise. Of course, this is a very, very broad issue, a broad topic, but it touches the three dimensions that we need to work in the future. And of course, during the pandemic crisis, I think all the limitations of the model of development that we are living in became more and more evident. So this is an important moment because of that, because we are seeing the limitations of the capitalist system, of the model of development that we are living in. We are seeing the limitations which were brought also by the environmental and the climate change crisis. But at the same time, it does make our task easier. So that's the great challenge I think we have ahead of us. So in terms of the model of development that we are living, the failures are quite evident within the pandemic crisis, because we see that to survive in this moment, we need to really depend on the public services, on public health systems. We need to take into account that the most affected populations are those which are not so protected, who are not so protected, like for instance, the precarious workers, those who don't have the same conditions to access health services. And so this shows clearly that if we were answering to this crisis through the private rules, the situation would be much worse than the one we are facing, and is already very tragic. But I think that now we have this public perception of the importance of having a system of regulation which provides the necessary services and rights to everyone. And so this is something that we can easily discuss. But as I said, it is not at the same time the best moment to bring all these dimensions together and to advance with a democratic answer, a left answer, because we are also seeing at the same time, and although it seems contradictory, it is not. Unfortunately, we are seeing the rise of far-right movements. We are seeing the rise of undemocratic movements. We are seeing in several parts of the world how the governments are behaving and removing freedom rights, citizen rights, and we have it within the European Union. We have seen it in the United States, in Brazil, in a lot of countries across the world. So what we are facing, unfortunately, at the same time, is a huge democratic step back. So we need to work on that as well and to put people first. And it is not only because of the emergency states which were declared, it is not only because of the fear, it has to do with it as well, but these times were used to advance in several policies which are inadmissible, like for instance, more aggressive policies concerning migrants, refugees, even more aggressive for policies concerning, for instance, indigenous peoples. And so what we are facing is a very aggressive way of doing politics with the excuse of the pandemic crisis, but trying to deeper as much as possible the fear that everyone is facing in this moment. And together with this increasing of representation of undemocratic values, we also see the pandemic being used as an excuse to impose some areas of digital surveillance, and which is in fact other forms of controlling ourselves and controlling democracy and threatening democracy. And it's a little bit like Naomi Klein said recently, we are facing a screen New Deal. It is the deal between the powers, those in power and in government, and those magnates of the digital corporations using these to make money, to make profit, and to, of course, be an ally in very authoritarian modes of exercising the power. So within this context, we, as I said, saw very well the limits of the model of development that we are living in. We also saw very well how inequality is prevailing and how inequality is even more visible with the pandemic crisis. We see and we saw and we will be seeing in the future increasing poverty, and all these dimensions of course have to do with the failures of the model of development and the failures in the answers to combat the crisis, the pandemic crisis. So with all these, we are also witnessing huge difficulties of the left and social movements, and our capacity to come together and to work together seems more limited now, because we see not only some fragmentation, but also huge difficulties in acceding to the public space. The public space is changing. The way we do politics in the public space is also changing. And I think we didn't find yet the way to get it, to recover, to have the capacity to continue to do politics against these authoritarian moves that we are witnessing. And of course, and to be short, of course, I think wonderful news was the Black Lives Matter movement, because it was able to broke this ice, let us say, this cage that we are living in the recent months, and brought a lot of people to fight for their rights, and also bringing a systemic problem and a very deep problem we have in all societies, which is racism, and is always forgotten when we are dealing about with public policies. Normally is not taken into account, and we have a long history of it. So we are facing all the dimensions of unfairness, inequalities, poverty, and non-recognition of rights. All of these dimensions were brought by the movement Black Lives Matter, which became a global movement, and with a lot of people engaging in it. I think this is a very good model for us to look at and to see how can we recover the public space and bring again these important issues to the center. On what we are seeing now is that there's this public perception at the European Union level that whatever will come from Europe will be good, because people are so afraid and feel so uncomfortable that there's this public perception. And we also need to combat that perception, because while we are here discussing, while we are doing our work, European Union is reinforcing the investment in defense and military response, is cutting the future funds for cohesion and fighting inequality and poverty. So unfortunately, the signs that we have is for the future, the recipe is still the same. So this is the moment that we need to come together and act. And that's the moment where we need, for sure, not only to recover the public space, but also to try to plan to have a democratic plan to recover the economy and the society, to have an economic transformation which gives the importance that needs to be given to the public services, the public health, the fight against climate change, the fight against inequalities, human rights and workers' rights. This is the moment, because we are in a very difficult situation, as I said, concerning the global atmosphere, but we also have all the conditions to show in every day, unfortunately, the limits of the model of development that we are living in. Thank you. I don't know if I was longer than...
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marisa. And although you've outlined the fact that there are huge problems, I'm pleased to tell you that we now have 2,000 people on this call. We believe that they're from every continent, and they're certainly from all the nations of the UK. So one of the things, and you concluded with this, is that this is the moment when we have to seize the time and say something has to be different. And so, you know, there are clearly a lot of people who want to take that step and say things can be different and another world is possible. Thank you very much for your contribution, Marisa. We now move to France, and I would like to give the floor to Danièle Obono, left-wing MP for La France Insoumise, Unbowed France. Danielle, I'm delighted that you're with us. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be part of this panel and to share with you thoughts and to debate about this very particular moment we are living. It's both frightening but also exhilarating, and I think for progressive and radical forces, it's a moment to be seized, because I think we really are, as a society, a human society is at the crossroad, and the COVID-19 pandemic actually showed what we will be facing again and again with the consequences of climate change, because I think this David said it earlier, that there are ecological factors that conquered to the pandemic, and also I think when even the supposedly most developed countries in the world, the European countries, the United States, were faced with this health hazard, there was no public service system strong enough, or there were a minority of countries that were able actually to face this situation because of the economic policies that have been implemented over the decades and that have consistently destroyed all the collective gains that working people have made over the years, building healthcare system and granting rights to workers to be protected, and the very economic policies that have destroyed our collective wealth have shown, I think, to millions of people their inadequacies. So I think we've been living, and we're still since the pandemic is not over, and we have to remain individually and collectively very aware of that. We're still undergoing, I think, a very traumatic time, but that has also that has also made it possible for something like a reset of priorities. I think that was also a moment when people actually realized that what was essential for life, what was essential in the society, were workers providing for our daily life, making possible for us to do basic things like heat and have food in our homes when we couldn't go out, and people cleaning around the cities, and also obviously health workers and people working in the hospital and all the healthcare system. And I think it was very important, because those are the very people who have been who have never been seen, who have been made invisible, who have been despised by the societal value system that put money and competition at the top of the value system. When what we saw is that, I think two important things is that it's our collective discipline for the most part here in France. When the pandemic hit, the government was unable to prepare for anything, and it's the people, the healthcare workers, that have been able actually to, despite the dire situation where the hospital system has been put, they were able to put themselves beyond the limits, human limits, to help us face the crisis. And it's also thanks to the citizen respecting the restrictive measure, and that actually made it possible for the slowing down of the virus. And so we saw that it's by the solidarity and the collective efforts that we were able to face. It's because of public service, healthcare public service, that we were able to face this very human situation we were in. And all the discourse about the market showed really their true colors, that the market was unable to provide for the needs to face it. So I think it's important, because now that some of the country are just supposedly going back to normal, and that's actually what the governments are trying to convince the people, that we need to go back to normal. And I think it's important. It's also been said all around the world, and people are aware of the thing, that the point that going back to normal is going back to what actually caused the crisis, the environmental crisis, the healthcare crisis. So we can't go back to normal, because normalcy, the capitalist neoliberal normalcy, is the very problem. So how do we go from there? And that's also one of the most inspiring aspect of the period, with the social movement, especially, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement that spread from the US to the rest of the world, but that also revived in every country the fight for justice, for equality, the anti-racist movement. That's what we have witnessed in France, where there have been massive, unprecedented anti-racist demonstration, despite the restraint of liberty, of freedom of movement, because the government also used some very anti-democratic measures, and we also saw the response of the government before the pandemic, but the pandemic were used, as others have said, to to put a stronger hold and to police society and to strengthen those authoritarian measures. But despite that, we saw thousands of a lot of young people, but people coming from all ages. But what was very striking in France, especially, is that the number of young people who had never been into social movement in demonstration, who didn't know actually how you do, and were like amazingly disciplined also, who despite the attempt of the police to create tensions, they were like very calm and with the determination, and they never let the police brutality that was actually directed at them when we were protesting against police brutality. They never let it destroy the movement. And now what we're seeing in France is the movements coming together and working their way toward each other. When we think about especially healthcare workers in France who had been on strike for a month, for over a year before the pandemic, they were striking against the restriction of the healthcare system, and they were not heard by the government. But when after month of applauding them on our balconies with the population support, they are back onto the streets now, and they are more determined than ever, which is very inspiring. We have the fight for justice against racism that is also on the rise. We have also young people for climate justice that are still organizing actions to put forward the climate justice environment. And which is very important also is the connection that are being built between those movements, especially the young people for climate justice and young people for justice against police brutality and against racism. I think it's a very inspiring moment, and we have all those slogans that activists have been shouting in demos over the last decade that are now being chanted by younger generations, and I think it's a very inspiring situation for us. It also puts a very high level of responsibilities, I think, for left forces, because now we also are put into a situation where we have we are a situation where the power are only standing because of their use of brute force, their use of police. Of course, in the US and in Brazil, for instance, we witnessed the most caricatural example of that with Bolsonaro and Trump. But you have different variation of this in France with someone like Macron, who looks and speak differently from Bolsonaro or Trump, but whose policies and actually the way he is turning now the government to the right and to the far right with links with and connection with the far right. He is ready to go and push the very hard right-wing neoliberal agenda despite the situation. So for the left forces, and I will end on that, I think we also need to talk about how do we build and help the movements we're witnessing and being part of to confront the government, to win victories, because we need concrete battles, like day-to-day bread and butter issue, especially when we are facing this massive economic and social crisis. We have to be able to help build those daily struggles for minimum survival, and also in this process to win electoral majority, to win also political majority and ideological majority on the basis of our program, which is actually the program that are now being put forward in the movement, like climate justice, police reform, and fiscal reform, and to share the wealth, and to be able to also transform our economic system to face climate change. So this is also, I think, a conversation we need to keep having, and put common mobilization dates on the agenda, so that also we show our strength worldwide. And I'm really excited to keep having the conversation and to build those international this international network and this international agenda with all of you. Thank you very much.
Danielle, thank you very much for joining us. It's very good to hear a voice from France this evening, and in particular, I think you're right, it is inspiring how many young people have risen to the challenge of all of those things that confront us and are actively involved. Thank you very much, Danielle. We now move to our friend and comrade from Ghana, Gyekye Tanoh from the Third World Network. Gyekye, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And like the previous speakers, I think it's a great honor to be here, precisely because of the challenge that we all have to contribute to resolving. And I think that the comrades who've spoken before me, what they've done is to insist on the necessity of the people on the left, of socialists, to recognize their special responsibilities in this period. And Danielle posed the question, a very valid question, I thought, about what it is to do. And I think that, I mean, of course, everybody has, we all have ways to contribute, but taking our cue from reality itself suggests to us some of the tasks that we have to prioritize. What the Black Lives Movement shows, for example, is that whatever it is, you have to insist on the necessity, the absolute necessity of resistance and of fighting back. You have to, because without that, there is greater divisions. Without that, there is a loss of hope. Without that, the likelihood that we are feeling powerless and therefore are more vulnerable to divisions and to being played off one against the other, that becomes enhanced. So the necessity of fighting back, the insistence on struggle, on unity in struggle, is an absolute requirement, which I think people on the left and socialists must make one of their priorities, one of their core, if you like, contributions to this process. That goes along with another feature of the system, which is exposed by Black Lives Matter, which is the irredeemable, roots and character of exploitation, division, and oppression within the global system that we live in, expressed as a form of inequality. And that is what Black Lives Matter is rising against. Black Lives Matter is rising, of course, primarily in response to institutionalized racism expressed by police violence, systematic police brutality against members of the Black and minority communities, especially Black communities, Black and minority communities in the United States. But there's nothing new in that as such. What is new is the way in which this is dovetailing with the devastation that the coronavirus is wreaking in Black and other minority communities. At the same time that there's growing inequality where people like Jeff Bezos and those who monopolize the retail industry like Amazon and so are making billions and billions for no extra work done, for no new innovation, for nothing at all, basically, simply because they are in a position to do so. There's so much concentration of wealth and power on the one hand, so much deprivation on the other hand, and so on. So, and this isn't something that starts today. And that is why, again, Black Lives Matter is an important moment of our education of how the system works, how we understand it. After all, its roots go back 500 years. Its roots go back, to slavery, the specific enslavement of a particular group of people from a particular part of the world geographically, the enslavement of Africans on a commercial basis for the New World. We know that. And this is the reason why since then, the position of Black people has been the most downgraded and the most dehumanized and so on. But let's understand that that is part of the system. And is that therefore something that is not necessarily targeted at Black people alone. It is targeted at Black people to ensure that that there is one more ballast, there is one more way in which you can systematize oppression and inequality so that those in power can maintain their power, they can exercise divide and rule, they can exercise monopoly. And that is why, even in Africa, you find that the experience of slavery wasn't simply about the oppression of Black people. For example, it led directly to the degradation of the position of women in our societies. Because in parts of West Africa, for example, the way in which slave raiding became an endemic occupation for so many people meant that violence, terrorizing communities from which you were going to enslave, and especially using sexual violence against women was one of the mechanisms through which this process was driven for 400 or 500 years. That leaves deep roots as you get, as you see in the United States in terms of anti-Black racism by white cops and the white capitalist establishment and so on and so forth. Same with ethnicity and so on. And the question of violence against women, we see it recurring all the time. In the period of the pandemic, in terms of lockdown, we see that it is women who are bearing the brunt of violence in terms of their partners and so on. We see that they are the ones bearing the brunt of the unpaid extra labor that is being burdened upon people because the health systems are not functioning due to the privatizations that people have talked about, and the whole crisis of feeding families, keeping families together and so on. And slavery inscribed this very deeply into African society in the same way as which it is inscribed everywhere in the world. And in a variety of different ways. Just one simple example of why that would be the case in this pronounced way in Africa is because the population crisis that slavery brought about. Slavery depopulated Africa. One of the reasons why Africa's development has been so severely and structurally retarded for so long. But it depopulated Africa in a way that a greater imbalance occurred even between men and women. In West Africa, for example, you had an average of 6 men to 10 women for hundreds of years. And therefore, the position of women being degraded in terms of polygamy, in terms of the violence that I talked about, and so on, these are things that in a moment where we have to talk about anti-racism, we also have to understand that opening the door to one form of oppression allows in many other forms of oppression as well. It legitimizes many other forms of oppression. And that includes not simply race or gender, but the conditions of life itself. Here we are in a situation where the pandemic is caused, we understand, by the degradation, part of the rapacious degradation of natural resources and the exploitation of the natural environment. That is one of the reasons why this is happening. David mentioned that. David from Brazil, a comrade from Brazil, mentioned that already. In Africa, which is another reason, just like Latin America, even more dependent on natural resource exploitation, the dangers of such public health emergencies are real. We've seen it with Ebola repeatedly since the 1970s. We saw it most recently from the 2013 to 2016 Ebola crisis, directly as a result of the greater crossover between animal life and human life because of the destruction, deforestation, mining, exploitation of oil and gas, and so on. And this is a systemic feature of our existence. Last week in the British media, for example, there was an article in The Guardian talking about how petroleum products sold in Nigeria. Nigeria is the biggest exporter of petrol in Africa. It is one of the benefits of Nigeria's oil, if you can call oil a benefit in any sense at all, which I understand it's, is that it has very low sulfur content. They call it the sweet Bonny Light content. However, in exchange for exporting 2 million barrels of oil a day by companies like Shell, BP, Total, and so on and so forth, Nigerians also import back 1 million tons of dirty oil every year to fuel their cars, their machines, and so on. This is a special brand of petroleum products sold by multinational oil companies like Vitol, Trafigura, and so on, only to Africa. Why is that? Because that devaluation that I'm talking about means that it also involves the devaluation of regulatory standards for the environment and so on. And therefore, the type of petrol that is sold in Nigeria, there is 200 times more sulfur content than will be allowed to be sold in Britain or in France. Okay, thousands of times more levels of environmental pollution visited on African people on a daily basis, simply because they can get away with it, but simply because we have structured to understand ourselves that the damage to people and to environment in Africa is something that has become a part of the cost. But that is exactly why, when you have the type of situation that we face today, the question about climate change, the question of environmental democracy and justice, the question about anti-racism, all those things need to be linked together. Because without that, you run a danger. You run a danger where the intellectual property, the technological gains of shifting energy sources, for example, from fossil industries to renewable energies, you will still require some form of natural resources to be extracted. You will still require copper for your electric cars. You will still require lithium for your batteries. You will still require cobalt, nickel, and so on and so forth. So you might change the energy source from fossil to renewable, but will it be under conditions that people in Africa and Latin America are suffering because of the extraction of raw materials the way it is today? Will it be under the type of monopoly conditions where international pharmaceutical companies hold patents and and so on? Will it be the kind of food chain monopolies that we see, which is driving the pollutants into our diets and so on and so forth? So for us to stand together to fight, it's important to understand that this is the moment to do so. It's also important to understand that we need to make concrete demands that level up, that rise everybody up in the fight for inequality. That is not simply a distant dream, but there are also things that are realizable here and now. And that is, to me, is a great merit of the Black Lives movements like the Black Lives Matter. Because when you struggle, you can win something. It's not simply the symbolism of a global movement, of bringing down statues which shouldn't have been erected in the first place. It is that you can will real change. When people talk in terms of a democratization of the police, of local authorities and so on, all those things can be extended. They can be extended into the workplace, into the schools, into the colleges, into the communities, and so on and so forth. And they can be extended also in the way in which different people are treated, whether it's in the form of the rules of migration and so on. Why? Because the questions of precarity, of degradation, of inequality that is taking a racial or otherwise form. In a world of free trade, despite the racist immigration laws, in a world of free trade, cheap Black labor or cheap women's labor or cheap Indian labor or local labor in Latin America has an impact of everybody. It has an impact of everybody because there's free movement of goods and services, even when there's not free movement of people. And when there is free people move eventually, as they will, as we see in terms of migration and so on, we find that they become a source of cheap labor, which gives a new ballast to the far right, to racists, and so on and so forth. So the necessity of insisting that there ought to be a standard that applies to everybody, and that the principle of redistributive justice is enacted is important. It is particularly important given where the world is going, not simply in the climate sense, but in the sense of population as well. Africa is the fastest growing population in the world. Everybody knows that. It is by far the youngest population in the world. The median age in Africa is 19 years old compared to Western Europe, which is about 45 years old. Okay, it is the fastest urbanizing population. By the middle of the century, there'll be more the new additions to the working population in the world. There'll be more Africans than Chinese or Indian. There'll be a majority of the world's population will be African by the end of the century, unless we are sure that the people can begin to make gains in terms of equalizing gains. The condition of precarity and forcing conditions of life down for majority of people will become even more systematic. And that's important why we have to build the struggles against ethnicity, against religious intolerance, against oppression in terms of sexuality and gender, in terms of race. But we have to root this in the economic democracy that Danielle talked about, giving people the means to have a productive life, giving people the income, the universal basic income in terms of goods, in terms of services, in terms of the material conditions of their existence, which ensure that all of us can gain together, that we can recompose and recombine, reunite mental and manual labor. That is not simply the corporations that hold the intellectual property patents. All of us can develop, whether we work in the health system, whether we work in food production, proper food production, whether we work in education and so on and so forth, or whether we're simply campaigners fighting for a better world for everybody. That should happen everywhere in the world, wherever we are. And I'm glad I'm on this panel to help us understand clearly where we take things from here and begin to take the next steps. Thank you very much.
Gyekye, thank you very much. That was a brilliant presentation, linking together all of the aspects of struggle. And we take from that your call for unity in struggle against exploitation, oppression and division. Thank you very much for your words. And now, before I introduce our last speaker, if I were in a hall physically speaking with you, I'd be holding up a bucket and saying, put lots of money into this bucket. But as this is a Zoom call, I'm simply going to ask you to make donations to the Arise Festival. There are 2 more events in the Arise Festival. They've appeared in the chat. Do please join in them, but do please think about making a donation if you can towards the running of this festival. This is critically a time when we need to be exchanging these important ideas from the left, as we are the people who have the ideas for the solutions to the massive problems that face us. So with that indication to you to make donations if you possibly can, I move to our last speaker, the former leader of the Labour Party, my friend and comrade and yours, Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Christine, thank you very much for what you just said and the way you're chairing this event, and indeed the way you chair so many of our events. It's really great and really helpful and a real inspiration as to how meetings should be run. And could I, before I say anything in the main text of what I want to speak about, just to say a big thank you to all those that have organized all these Arise events, because we've got 2,000 people on this call tonight all over the world. We're speaking to each other and we're speaking together because we are sharing values, we're sharing demands, but above all, we're learning for each other, from each other and for each other. And so can I just suggest that during this corona crisis, which is of course a global crisis, we've all learned a lot about the importance of communications and the ability to speak to each other without the expense of traveling to meetings and conferences all over the place. And also many people have been able to take part who would never be able to travel anywhere for lots of different reasons. So can we make sure that all of us think differently about how we organize events and meetings in the future to ensure they're as inclusive as possible and we have global voices at them? I was at a meeting of my local branch Labour Party a few weeks ago, not a particularly large meeting. It's one local branch in a community of less than 10,000 people. We had speakers from South Africa, from Pakistan, and from Brazil at the same meeting, and it made the experience real for the people at that meeting. So please can we think about that for the future? And I want to say thank you to the other speakers, to Marisa, to Danielle, and to my good friend Gyekye for what they've just said this evening at this meeting and the experiences they brought to us. Because there are many people around the world who get very depressed. They become disempowered. They are facing a daily barrage of attacks from the mainstream media if they're political activists. And for many people, life is a grinding struggle just to make sure there's enough food on the table to feed the family, and a secure job is going to be available after the corona crisis has passed. And this corona crisis is a turning point in global history and a turning point in the actions of progressive people all around the world. A turning point because we've suddenly learned exactly how vulnerable we all are. I think it was Bernie Sanders, when questioned about his plans for universal health care in the United States, and he was asked to defend it. Now, it didn't actually be very difficult to defend it, and he didn't find it very difficult at all. He simply said this: my health, my well-being is as secure as the most vulnerable people in my community or my street or my city or my town. And what the corona crisis has shown, that the poorest people in the poorest countries pay the highest price, that those that have no access to healthcare of any sort, and there are millions and millions around the world who have no access to any kind of healthcare at all, they are paying the very highest price. So when the World Health Organization talks, as it does, about the need for universal access to healthcare, let's make that a reality. Let's make that one of our global demands. We're celebrating in this country, yesterday as a matter of fact, the birthday of our National Health Service. It has lots of problems, but we're very, very proud of the fact we have a National Health Service, free healthcare at the point of need for everybody. Fantastic achievement, but it's under threat from privatization, and it's under threat from the stress that it faces, as are many other health services around the world. And so, in response to the corona crisis, let's recognize how vulnerable people are of a pandemic spreading very, very quickly, and say to our national governments, listen when a message is sent out saying there is an epidemic and it could become a pandemic. Don't sit on your hands for 3 months and pretend it'll go away. Do something about it. And that way, you'll reduce the number of people that will be affected by it. You'll reduce the number who die prematurely because of it. And you'll make the whole world a healthier and safer place. The biggest contributions to ill health in the world are actually clean water, good food, clean air, and access to medical support when you need it. And during this crisis, for the first time, many people have actually perversely been able to breathe clean air because of the lockdown and the suspension of a lot of economic activity in big cities. When we come out of coronas, let's not go back to polluted seas, polluted rivers, polluted streets. Let's actually try and do something better. Now, all the speakers referred quite rightly to Black Lives Matter and the worldwide campaign in support, yes, of George Floyd, but also in support of the people of the United States, the Black communities all across the United States who've had enough of police treatment of them. And that has been mirrored in most other countries around the world. It is a global movement for justice. It is a global movement against racism. But what that global movement also shows, and I think the experience of all of the speakers here this evening shows the need for a change in the way in which we understand our past and understand our history. Children in my country are brought up often in school to believe that somehow or other the British Empire was a benign affair and it was all about improving the lives of people all over the British Empire, and that slavery was an unfortunate aspect of it, but it was abolished by actions of liberal, well-meaning people in Britain. Nothing could be further from the truth. Slavery was a systematic destruction of the humanity of people of West Africa, a refusal to countenance any understanding of their history, their societies, and they were brutally loaded onto slave ships, taken to the Caribbean in order, if they survived the journey, that is, to work on sugar plantations, and that sugar then made a lot of people in Western Europe extremely rich. And when slavery was finally abolished, it was largely because of the slave uprisings themselves in Jamaica, in Santo Domingo, in Haiti, and all over, that made the trade impossible and made the continuation of that exploitation impossible. That is the history I want our children to understand, the bravery of those people who stood up against slavery, the slaves themselves. There's a book written by a late good friend of mine, Richard Hart, fantastic book, saying how blacks abolished slavery, how slaves abolished slavery. Surely that is the lesson that's being learned. And because of the heightened interest in an understanding of history, because of what happened to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, I think this is the time to re-examine history and understand that situation globally. All speakers have referred, and quite rightly so, to the environmental crisis that we face. And there's a connection between all of these things. If we carry on pumping pollutants into the air, we end up polluting everybody's air. If we carry on pumping horrible stuff into rivers and seas anywhere in the world, it comes back to hit us all. But again, the effects of the environmental crisis are not uniform. They are different across the world. The shortest life expectancy and the most polluted lives are those for people who live in the most overcrowded cities with the worst sanitation and the least access to good quality food and healthcare. So environment is about improving the living standards of everybody in a sustainable way, which is why I was very proud in the election last year, and indeed throughout the past few years, to put forward the concept of a green industrial revolution. The last industrial revolution is, in a sense, the technical revolution, the information revolution, which means, in fact, we can talk to each other. That in turn has made a small number of people incredibly rich. And the richest organizations and corporations and people on the planet are those trading in information and information technology at the moment. The previous industrial revolution was about higher technology, was about cruel, crude and dirty industrial developments, which so polluted much of Western Europe and North America, and then went on to pollute other parts of the world. The next industrial revolution must be a green revolution, where we create jobs by generating clean, green energy. We create jobs by creating clean, green machinery. And we create jobs by sustaining the natural world. And so the ever-growing thirst for higher productivity on diminishing amounts of agricultural land is actually counterproductive. You have to look at the thing holistically. You have to look at the environmental network, the biodiverse network in which we all survive and can sustain our very being. And so when COP26 is held sometime next year, it was due to be held in Glasgow late this year, but it's obviously been postponed because of the corona crisis. Let's use that as an opportunity. Let's use that as an opportunity to put forward all of the ideas about a green industrial revolution around the world, and make sure that we don't just confirm the 2015 Paris Agreement on emissions targets. That of itself will not do. We've got to go a lot further and a lot faster to try and achieve net zero by 2030. You won't do that if you're building polluting power stations and putting more and more diesel and petrol vehicles on the road, when you could be putting electric vehicles on the road, and you could be developing sustainable energy production through wind, solar, wave, hot rocks, and so on. There's a lot of other systems of doing things. And this in turn helps to create jobs in the economy. But if post-corona, the world descends into yet another round of IMF free market inspired economics, we're not going to provide the jobs that are necessary, and we're not going to deal with the next corona crisis any more than we're going to make the world a sustainable place. So let's make sure that in all of our countries, all of our societies, we're arguing from the same perspective, that there has to be investment-led economics that invests in the public services, invests in the housing needs of people, and invests in the training and education needs of the young generation that are paying the price for all of this at the present time. If we just give in to the global corporations and say they're the ones that can run the world, they're the ones that can decide all these things, then we will have lost that argument. I don't want the world's economic future decided by an elite who meet in Davos once a year. I want our economic future to be decided by the people on the streets, in the meetings, all around the world. Politics comes from communities, from the grassroots. And our media corporations, our global media, actually systematically disempower people. They abuse those that stand up on behalf of others. They denigrate those that have ideas, and they seek to develop a sort of narrative that all that matters in the world are two things. One is celebrity, and the other is being incredibly rich. And sometimes the two things go together. Well, I don't mind celebrities. I enjoy reading about them occasionally, but they're not going to solve the world's problems any more than giving more power to the very richest corporation is going to do it. It has to be about how we empower ourselves. And the last thing I'd say is this. There is a human rights crisis around the world. There is a growth of arms expenditure, and there are 65 million refugees around the world. There are 65 million people who want to live, want to contribute, want to do something with their lives, and they can't. They're stuck in refugee camps. They're frightened. They're dying in the Mediterranean. They're dying on borders around the world. There are more than 1 million Rohingya refugees living in Bangladesh at the present time. These are people that all want to contribute in their lives. We've got to start speaking up for refugees around the world, and then look at the causes of their search for a place of security, the causes human rights abuse, the causes war, the causes all those sort of problems. So let's together speak up to try and achieve a better and more just world. And the Arise Festival is a way of doing all that. And I think every time any of us around the world do set up things like Arise in every country, let's invite each other to take part, invite each other to share our experiences, and so that we're always contacting and talking to each other. And that global solidarity is far, far more powerful than anything Fox News, Murdoch Media, or anybody else can put together. When we talk to, listen to, and understand each other, and understand the struggles that achieved the women's right to vote, the struggles that ended slavery, the struggles that brought about public services, the struggles that brought about social justice. It's the struggles that empower us all. And the cultural values, the joy of literature, art, and music that go alongside all of that. That's what our strength is. That's what we, all of us, have got that the rich elites will never have. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you so very much. You know, despite the fact that we are facing multiple crises, it's always an absolute pleasure to listen to you. And you always, I think, make sure that audiences leave the speeches that you make and the presentations that you give. Audiences leave with a sense of absolute hope, because clearly there is a better way of doing things. So it is about unity and struggle. You know, if you don't struggle, you will not win anything. But if you do struggle, there's a very great chance that we can make a fantastic difference. So I'm assured that we haven't.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Christine. That was lovely. The noises off from my grandnephew trying to join in. He's not quite 2 yet, but he's trying to join in already. He's starting very young.
He is adorable. I haven't met him. He's lovely. Anyway, I just want to thank all of our speakers, Jeremy, obviously, but also David, Marisa, Gyekye, and Danielle on behalf of all of those of you who participated, and to say that those remarks that Jeremy made about the need to for us to exploit the technology that now exists to make sure that we can have these real-time international exchanges, I think is a big thing for us to learn from this crisis. We do have very big battles ahead, but we also have an enormous amount of campaigning to do, and we know that we can do it. It's essential that we do it for ourselves and on behalf of others, so that we can look to making sure that people, that the planet, and that peace are put ahead of profits. And we must make sure that post-COVID, we don't just go back to how things were, that we actually look at making sure that we are building a better world, and that we do that with all the progressive forces in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, and globally. So just before I conclude, let me remind you that there is another Arise event at 7 o'clock on Wednesday, Socialist Solutions to Climate Change, and how absolutely critical that is. And so with that, friends and comrades, and with again, thanks to all of our speakers and all of you from all over the world who have joined us on this conference and in this great event. Thank you, and good night, and have an even better day tomorrow. Thank you very much. Goodbye.